This week, you could win one of 3 bundles for the Silver Bayonet. Winners will be chosen from OnTableTop.com, YouTube, and the Carpathians Games members.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Silver Bayonet theme week. I'm joined once again by Ben, and with us is Joe McCullough, the man responsible for it all. It's great to have you back on the channel, Joe.
Yeah, it's fun to be here.
So we are midway between the release of Carpathians and the upcoming Canadian supplement for the Silver Bayonet. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to catch up with yourself and have a chat with you about how the supplements are developing and your work on the Silver Bayonet. First off the bat, the supplement itself, Carpathia, which if people haven't seen already, Castle Fier, is a smaller sort of affair than your Graves supplements,
yes.
for a better word. But it seems to be the sort of the format it's being used for Canada as well, where you have a set of new rules, new soldiers, something added in that is nice but not necessary if you don't want to pick up the supplement. But then there's also a couple of campaigns, a short solo or cooperative campaign, and then a sort of a longer form campaign. Do you want to talk us through a bit about the decision to go that way?
Yeah, I guess there's two kind of elements to this. The first being a very practical one of just my time. Now with kind of several games ongoing at the same time, I said, look, I just don't have the time to write the same kind of level of material for this that I have in the past for, say, Frostgrave. So I talked to Phil about it. And one thing we want, though, is we want the game to feel alive. So we still want a good amount of material coming out, a couple of supplements a year, or at least you never want to kind of go a year without a supplement. And I said, so if we're going to do that, why don't we, A, make it smaller, and then it's not as big a commitment. And at the same time, why don't we look at bringing some other people into the project? And that's not just to kind of help with time, but also, unlike my other games, Silver Bayonet has a historical basis, or at least a partial historical basis. And I'm not an expert in Napoleonic history. I'm widely read, but I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not an expert in specific parts of it, whereas other people are. So, for example, with Canada, we got Ash coming up. He may not be an expert in Napoleonics necessarily, but he is an expert in Canada, being that's where he's from and stomps around. And there's some other people they're talking to and coming that are more knowledgeable in certain aspects of that. In that sense, it was really nice to be able to hand it off to other people and say, why don't you bring what you know to this game, things that I'm not going to be able to do. So that was really nice. There's something to be said for the short form. One, it's cheaper, so it's a much easier kind of sell, or for a fan, it's a much easier pickup. It's just a bit easier to digest. And it also just tends to mean that they're very focused little books. While you do have a few new soldiers and a few new things, it's really, so the Carpathians is really about the 2 campaigns, the one competitive and the one solo. Yeah, it's almost more like a little magazine that comes out every so often that you can pick up and add to the collection without it kind of being a major commitment. It's a bit of an experiment, but it's a fun one to try and see where it goes.
I've enjoyed playing through. We played through the Broken Watchtower, myself and Shay, cooperatively, and we threw hard mode on there, as people will be able to see those games throughout this week anyway. But it was a lot of fun to spend a couple of weeks in advance sort of tinkering and setting things up. So, things like the spine, crossing the broken spine, just getting a bit of foam out and making essentially a 3 foot by 1.5 foot flat top mountain top that we could go skirting across. So it's not a big buy-in, like you say, and you can sit there and go, well, here are the particular objectives or scenarios. What have we got? We've got some trees and bits and pieces. Oh, we need some like hilltops, or we need a specific piece of terrain, and you just sit there and go, right, well, I can knock that out in a day easily. But it adds so much more when you're playing these narrative campaigns to have the stuff on the table without having that big ask of building a ton of terrain or very specific pieces.
I think that's another aspect too. It's the first time I've tried to take forward a game that is designed to be both playable competitively and solo as a core idea. I've kind of experimented and bounced around, and if you're going to have supplements that have both a competitive and a solo, you don't kind of want to overload these supplements for one or the other, and you want to make them. So if you're just going to play solo, you want it to be cheap enough that it's still worthwhile for you to buy it, and the same vice versa. So again, that small form really works, but it is interesting to push forward in both of those aspects of the game.
When you decided to go off to the Carpathian mountain, then obviously when people are initially told about the Silver Bayonet, it is a fantasy horror within the Napoleonic Wars, but this sort of pulls people away from what a lot of people will think of as the Napoleonic Wars, and it's just sort of, you're now in part of Eastern Europe, you're in the Carpathian Mountains in a castle, and it's more a typical / Hammer horror style Gothic horror feel to it. Was that a conscious decision to go, our setting is that period, but it doesn't have to be focused on the warfare itself, on the conflict in Europe?
It's very much a love letter to Dracula. I didn't actually read Dracula until about 10 years ago. And I think it was one of those kind of arrogance, like Dracula, everybody reads that, so I'm too cool for that, right? And then I read it and I'm like, oh my God, this book's amazing. No wonder it's survived, And so for me, it is the Gothic novel. And so, yeah, I think for Silver Bayonet, I wanted to show you can focus on kind of either of these aspects, on the Napoleonic War and the Gothic. You can bring them together, but you can also kind of play around at either end of that. And this was mine. I want to dive totally Gothic here. And so, yeah, it really is kind of playing in Dracula's castle and seeing if you can survive that. I do also think, having worked for years at Osprey, I have this very skewed view of the Napoleonic Wars, because I'm obviously surrounded by all the Osprey books, which have just every soldier that ever fought. So to me, it kind of gives them equal weighting. It's like, oh, here's the book on French infantry. Of course, that makes up 50% of all the guys that fought. Whereas over here, it's your guys from Romania. It's like, oh, okay.
Was it fun looking at the sort of folk horror elements and sort of mining the depths of, I imagine, many books and internet searches to look for all sorts of strange creatures and things to bring into the game? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge mythological, legendary folklore kind of guy, and that's just one of the big things. I've always wanted to go to the Carpathians. I've never actually made it, but one day I will. But yeah, I wanted to dig into that and really pull some of that into the book. So, with Frostgrave, I'm always kind of inventing things from Folklore now. It's just like, well, this is a spider with the head of a giant or something, whereas this, one of the creatures in there he is, actually is, I don't even know how you say his name in Romanian, but he's basically a giant dog ogre, or he's a big ogre with a dog head, but he's got multiple eyes. And I mean, in terms of kind of folklore, he just serves a kind of ogre role. He eats people that try to cross his bridge or whatever, but just changing that visual really brings a different sense to it. It's like, yeah, but this is something different because it's a dog, and it's got 4 eyes. What's that about? And just gives you some real flavor of that. In the same way, you've got what is essentially your classic fairy tale witches in there, but the Romanian one has just a little bit of its own flavor of kind of this dark guardian of the woods. And yeah, there she is. So I wanted to bring that in, and that really helps generate scenario ideas. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, because when you dig into these kind of things, you find so much of it's familiar and yet slightly different, which I think is especially good for kind of
a nice bit of the uncanny kind of thing. Yeah. When it comes to the art and stuff that we've been showing off and things here, do you see that really late in the process, and then you're like, oh my God, that's amazing? Or do you start off with descriptions and things, and then artists feedback to you, or you see that through Osprey, and then you start to develop things as you go? What's the process there for that?
It starts off with, basically, Osprey tells me how much art is going to be in the book.
Right.
So they're going to say, we're going to have 4, 5, whatever, big figure scenes, and then we want 6 little vignette kind of things or whatever. And so I'll write up a brief for each of those. And I tend to write very brief briefs. I don't tend to think very visually. I very much think in words, and so I struggle sometimes with kind of coming up with visuals. And that's why I'm really grateful to Osprey when they get artists that can kind of run with it. So I probably said, it's an ogre with a dog head and he's got 4 eyes, and that's probably all I said, and then blam, so then whenever later I'll actually get a sketch, and then they'll say, how does this look? And in fact, the guy who does Silver Bayonet, who's done most of the Silver Bayonet stuff, tends to send 3 little sketches. So you'll have that guy, and then you'll have him in a different pose, or maybe you'll have him, slightly longer ears or whatever. But and then me and Phil or me and Chris, the other editor on the line, will say, I like number 2, and if we all like number 2, bang, we go with that. If we don't, we fight over it, and I lose. But but that's also a good chance to say, whoops, we've gotten something really wrong here. This didn't, usually that's my fault because I'll have forgotten to put something into my very brief. It's like, oh, actually, he should have 4 eyes. Doesn't happen much, but it's good to have that catch right there so that the artist hasn't gone too far. And then I often won't see it until right before kind of it goes to press. They'll show it to me and say, just making sure this is good to go. Yep. So, and then but really the editors end up doing more work talking directly to the author than I do. But that's probably peculiar to me. I think Osprey would be happy for me to have a bigger voice, but I'm happy to let the artist be an artist and me to write words for the most part.
It's the best way. Delineation of jobs there.
Yes.
Nobody treads on anybody else's toes. Now, moving away from the Carpathians, you've been working on a supplement yourself, which is due out, I think, first quarter next year.
Sounds right.
I haven't seen the actual date anywhere on the Osprey's website for pre-orders even yet. So these things are always subject to floating around a little bit. But you've been delving into Egypt, another classic horror genre. Then,
well, this is one where the history and the classic actually meet, because Napoleon does launch a major campaign into Egypt, and it's an utter disaster. I mean, it's just in its very own way, it's quite horrific because they just had no idea what an Egyptian desert was like.
They found out though.
Exactly, they found out the hard way and the buzzard way, and so it's just and meanwhile, again, your kind of classic horror, more than Gothic really, but the Mummy is just one of your classic villains, and Egypt has always been in fact, I think it's related. Napoleon himself probably had this sense of he probably would have thought it as the Mystic East. We don't think of it that far east anymore, but this kind of almost other world, this ancient land that drew him in. And I think it still draws us in and has a very fantastical feel. And I thought, man, I can't not take that opportunity to bring those two things together. And even I also thought this actually, I didn't think of this until I was working on it, but I thought this actually makes a really good story point. Strategically, there's not really a lot of reason for Napoleon to run off and attack Egypt. They had some idea that they're going to cut the British supply lines to India, but
up with the
it's a pretty weak justification.
Yeah.
So what was Napoleon really doing? And so I thought, well, in the Silver Bayonet world, he was probably looking for something powerful, and it's really kind of after that point you get this meteoric rise by Napoleon up to emperor, and I thought, well, whatever he was looking for, he obviously found, So I thought, if that's happening, the British and everybody's going to go, what the heck did he find? We got to go check, So it's a story of everybody else going to check what the heck he found. And,
what's out there? Yeah, because Napoleon landed in Alexandria first, and then went, oh, this isn't what we expected. Let's push on to the pyramids, Cairo.
Exactly.
So clearly he's following the Brendan Fraser route throughout Egypt.
Get on the right side of the river.
Find Hamanatra. So what sort of thing can people expect to see then in Egypt? Is it more of the same with a sort of a long form competitive campaign and then a shorter solo again.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, it's exactly that. It's I think again five scenarios competitive, 3 solo. There's a bit more kind of optional rules for playing in Egypt because obviously, unlike the Carpathians and unlike the main book, you've got a very different setting. You know, like there's basically just nothing in Europe, like a giant desert. Well, maybe a bit in Spain, but but nothing like the Sahara. So I wanted some rules that brought that flavor. So you've got rules for kind of massive heat and walking over sand and dying of thirst and things like that you can use or you don't have to. They're just there if you want to add that flavor to it. But some people I'm sure won't want that extra complication. But also I just think it's a real nice excuse for gamers because a lot of gamers, myself included, my main kind of terrain set is a very kind of temperate European green grass, lots of trees kind of thing. And it's nice to have an excuse sometimes to get a sand table out and do put some. I mean, doesn't everybody want some kind of fallen columns and crumbling Egyptian statues on their table and have that excuse to use those? And I just thought, so why not give people that excuse?
Obviously, with Napoleon's campaign, the conditions they were totally unprepared for, and it impacted the campaign so much. So the fact that you've brought things like that in, even if they're optional, and whenever I see an optional rule that makes life harder for me, I generally include it because I apparently am like that. But having things like the sandstorms, the difficulty in traversing the desert, lack of water, all of those.
Favorite things kind of reading up on it was the point where they've crossed the desert and they finally reach the Nile, and all these guys are running up to the Nile because they're dying of thirst, and immediately a bunch of them are attacked by crocodiles. And I'm just thinking, like, I don't actually know if I can write anything more horrific than that. The crocodiles are in there, and I was like, oh man, I got to get in there because that's just that's the most horrific thing ever.
Yeah, nobody was expecting that to come out of the water.
I mean, it must have, and at that time they probably thought dragons were bursting out of the river at them because none of them had ever seen anything like that. So,
apart from the logistics mechanics, the weather and terrain, that sort of thing, I see there is a camel coming now. I know you often add additional soldiers and things like that, but this time round, have we got a new type of mount coming? Because that would be really
cool. I wrote rules for camels, and then I play tested them, and I really didn't like them. And then I wrote some new rules for camels, and I really didn't like them. And what I discovered was, like, all the rules I was writing were less fun than playing with a horse. So what I eventually ended up doing was saying camels work the same as horses when you're on the sand, and just leave it at that. If you want your heavy cavalry mounted on camels, they can be mounted on camels, and don't worry about that. What I do have is some new soldiers that are more appropriate to the setting. So there is now an Egyptian unit that you can play, or you can draw these guys into your own warband, so you can have a Bedouin guide in your warband, nice. And you can, field some of these other guys. I mean, so you got the Mamelukes. The problem with an Egyptian warband is you basically have the Mamelukes, and then nothing else they have is of any quality whatsoever. Yeah. So there's some cool Mamelukes, and then you're really straining if you're playing an Egyptian warband. You have your Bedouin guide, but also then you can bring those into your own unit. So it gives you both something new to try out completely, or a little bit to add to yours. And you can throw your guys up on camels if you want, because why would you not if you're playing an Egypt game?
Well, I mean, everybody likes the sight of a camel biting and spitting at horses. It's good.
Exactly.
It's good times.
You punch your camel out.
Are we going to be seeing a little bit of sort of tomb delving and raiding and that kind of thing, and sort of uncovering of traps and stuff?
There is a bit of trap. So the solo one is a bit more like that because it felt more appropriate. So that one, is mostly underground. The competitive one is both kind of about a journey, and then that final bit, is kind of in your Indiana Jones and Last Crusade kind of Petra-esque kind of setting. But so there's a little bit of, I didn't want to overdo it, but there is a little flavor of the kind of Indiana Jones classic trap thing going on there. So,
pictured
and
here,
you gotta have scorpions and skulls,
the previous adventurers who delved into this tomb.
Exactly. Didn't work out so well.
Don't worry about that curse. I'm sure it's completely fictional. Obviously, Egypt is, I imagine, written by this stage and done and dusted. Are you planning on coming back yourself? Because I know the idea is to pull in some other authors, the likes of Ash and other people to work on other areas. Is there anything that you're thinking yourself would be nice to explore? It's
funny because when I wrote Silver Bayonet, I was sure this was going to be the game where I just wrote the book and I was done. I'm never going to write anything. Exactly. I'm never going to write anything for it again. And then I make the mistake of going online and onto the Facebook groups, and like people are just having so much fun and they're making so much cool stuff, and the enthusiasm so infectious that I went back and I'm like, all right, I got to write one. Let me write one. And then it became two. And so while I have no specific plans to write anything more, I never seem to have any specific plans until I do it. So it could definitely happen.
Because the thing for us, obviously, we see a lot of community members working on projects of various types. And we've got one community member's done a spectacular Silver Bayonet based around the retreat from Moscow.
Okay.
And it's just great. Heading off to the east, having the full winter type blizzard coming in, all of that. And another has taken the Silver Bayonet to Mexico.
Really?
And has been doing stuff there. And even though it's termed as Napoleonic, really it's just the time period, and you can sort of branch out to anywhere on the planet you want, as we see with Canada, and obviously tangentially connected via the British Empire, but it's separate and distinct from what's happening in Europe with the Napoleonic Wars. So there's a whole world that could be played about in Black Powder. I know the Asian connection, obviously Egypt links that quite nicely anyway, where you've got the part of the British sort of chain there, but you really can just pick areas and go frolicking into them.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it's one of the kind of like the last great eras of adventure, because you can't fly anywhere, and there's something really nice, both adventure wise and certainly wargaming wise, about you've got black powder, so you got guns, but you still better have a sword, because once you fire that gun, you don't have a gun anymore. So you've still got that swashbuckling that you're going to, in another, maybe really about 100 years, but you're going to lose, as you start to get automatic weapons and bolt action rifles and stuff. It just loses a bit of something. And when you start getting wireless communication and things like that, this is the really, you got to go somewhere, and then you're basically stuck there. You're taking the boat back, or you're walking out and no help is coming because you got no way to call for any. So you could easily take it beyond the Napoleonic Wars and go on the world tour. And in some ways that is what Canada is. It's less about, because the Napoleonic Wars weren't happening there. You've got the War of 1812, which you can argue one way or the other, but I think most of the scenarios in that are a little more of the adventure mold than they are of the kind of war mold.
Out into the savage frontier.
Exactly. And I think, and you get some of that kind of retreat from Moscow vibe in it, because it is very much a struggle against the environment itself, which like you get in Egypt too, but in a very different way. Frying to death instead of freezing to death. But,
neither are great options to be had.
No, not so much. But it's also true that like each of these places has such great and distinct mythology that it will be great to explore that. And probably I will return to the game as soon as I, for whatever reason, get hooked in on somebody's mythology or something. But it's a little more daunting to write, because with Frostgrave, Stargrave, I can't get it wrong. Whatever I make up is what I make up. And, while you got some defense when you're writing the Carpathians, it's got vampires, so, I can't get those wrong. But, you still don't want to stumble too badly over the history or mess up somebody's mythology. So
well,
you got to do a little more research and be a little more careful and respectful when you do it. So.
It'll be interesting to see where you go, and also where other people take it. Like I say, seeing somebody dive into Mexico, obviously I could see the retreat from Moscow. That makes perfect sense. But somebody going, you know what, this sounds great for Mexico. I'm going to go there and do that. And I was looking at it from the point of view of Ireland. There was about 4 or 5 rebellions in the same sort of period. So much so that Napoleonic towers were made all the way around the coast to prevent a French force landing there and attacking England from behind. You're thinking, well, at that point, you know, we're past history. We're into a fantasy realm. That could be amusing to go and see what the Shia are up to, kicking around.
Oh, absolutely,
as well.
absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, Ireland obviously has such a huge mythology that you can draw from. Its Napoleonic history is a mess, but
oh yeah, very much 100%. We were here, there, and everywhere.
Sure there's fun to be had in that too. So
I mean, that pretty much describes most of Irish history.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
True. It's really fun because this is the first time that one of my games has been kind of taken by other people, and I'm really interested to see where people go. And I suspect, as I see what they've done, that'll reignite my interest. Oh man, I hadn't thought of that. And like, how could I use that and then run with it? So
it's been interesting to see both the direction you're taking it and where other people are going to be taking it as well, far beyond the realms of Europe and the Low Countries. Then the fantasy and world is much, much richer. It's been a pleasure to talk to you as well, Joe.
Yep, it's been fun.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them below. If you're not a member of the Silver Bayonet Facebook group, you should probably join that. There's some absolute corking stuff in there as well.
Some great stuff there.
But until next time, bye-bye.
This week, you could win one of 3 bundles for the Silver Bayonet. Winners will be chosen from OnTableTop.com, YouTube, and the Cult of Games members.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.